Miss Mirabelle Shelley.
That ain't my name. Not anymore. From now on, it's just Belle.
20 concealed stories about sex in the old Wild West. Ever wondered what really went on behind the dusty facade of the old Wild West? Well, hold on to your hats, because today we're delving deep into the hidden tales of sex in the frontier, a side of history they don't teach you in school. Get ready for a wild ride through 20 concealed stories about sex in the old Wild West that'll make you see the frontier in a whole new light. Number 20. America's oldest profession was in full swing. The Old West is known for one very clear thing. Sex workers were everywhere. What's surprising is the range of such options throughout the West. Some places were more stereotypical in terms of the treatment of those who worked within them. Others held this kind of work in higher regard, with expansive and elaborate spaces for workers to do business. This kind of work was also indicative of socioeconomic classes in Old West society. Most of these workers were young, 30 or younger, largely uneducated, and in many cases, illiterate. Some were immigrants, and pricing was based not only on looks, but also nationality and ethnicity. Like the anonymous, easily replaced miners and railroad workers of the American frontier, sex workers filled a social and economic function necessitated by capitalism, but, as individuals, were largely irrelevant and forgotten. The Wild West had lots of men and few women. Therefore, prostitution became the solution. Although illegal, prostitutes could be found in every town. There were madams who ran the brothels, high-class courtesans who catered to wealthy clients, and streetwalkers who earned money in the dark corners of the towns. Some prostitutes and madams became inspiration for novels and obtained a legendary status in the folklore of the Wild West. Number 19. Cross-dressing went both ways. It was a surprise to historian Peter Boag when he was researching the Old West that he discovered how common cross-dressing was. Women often dressed as men to get ahead and gain advantages denied to them during this time because of their gender. However, men engaged in the practice as well. During a talk on sexuality and gender issues of the American West at the University of Wyoming, Boag stated, "What I was unprepared for when I started uncovering all these female-to-male crossdressers, I also started to uncover hundreds of stories of men who dressed as women." Number 18. Birth control was basically poison. It might be difficult for you to imagine why, in an era of freewheeling attitudes, people did not have as many children as they used to. Condoms were available, but very expensive. So many people relied on medications to end any pregnancy. These substances contained toxic ingredients, often from plant sources, that would end unwanted pregnancy upon arrival. For women engaging in this type of work, pregnancy was a major hazard. Not only could it end their careers, it was also life-threatening. In fact, many women on the frontier passed during childbirth. Women were often left with the choice of life-ending pregnancies or noxious substances to end an unwanted pregnancy. Unlike today, where safe sex is preached and practiced, the Wild West didn't use much protection. In fact, condoms were so expensive that people had to find other ways to prevent spreading of diseases and unwanted pregnancies. That's why prostitutes often used abortifacients, which had poisonous ingredients from plants that would often kill unwanted pregnancy once ingested. It's sad, but in the Wild West, many women had to decide whether to kill the baby or risk the high possibility of dying while giving birth. Number 17. Gender roles. As you think about the Old West, your mind might conjure up images of tough, macho men who embodied stereotypical stereotypes of masculinity that may come to mind when you think of these men. A cowboy riding valiantly on his horse to rescue a poor damsel that's tied to the railroad tracks, for instance, spitting dip, loading guns, and drinking hard. If that's how you view the Old West, you might be shocked to know how cowboys really viewed homosexuality. Wild West society didn't necessarily label people homosexual or heterosexual, but rather allowed each person to be who they need to be at any given moment. In an interview, Homos on the Range, How Gay Was the West?, University of Colorado at Boulder History Department Chairman Peter Boag, author of the book Same-Sex Affairs, said people engaged in same-sex activities weren't seen as homosexual. When women weren't present in large communities, say a mining camp full of men, for example, some men would fill the role of women for physical pleasure and domestically, and normal gender roles were challenged. In effect, men in the Old West got it where they could. Many people think of the Wild West as cowboys riding horses, rocking thick mustaches and carrying a pistol on his side. And that's partly true, yes, but there was another side of the Wild West that may surprise you, like the positive way homosexuality and gender roles were viewed. Basically, the Wild West didn't identify people as homosexual or heterosexual. With a book written by Peter Boag called Homos on the Range, How Gay Was the West, saying that people engaged in same-sex activities weren't seen as homosexual. In many cases, when groups of guys were out of town on work trips, many men were assigned to act as women and, well, you can probably figure out what happened from there. Guys in the Wild West got theirs where they could. Number 16. There wasn't much education on the topic. The problem was that there was no proper education regarding intimacy, which meant that people not only didn't know enough about their parts, but they also did not know anything about sexually transmitted infections. Packets called marriage manuals were available to give some information in the late 1800s. However, in addition to being inaccurate, these packets stressed the importance of only engaging in the act within marriage. They also highlighted how self-given pleasure was unhealthy because the use of a man's seed for anything other than procreation was frowned upon in the eyes of the Lord. If you wanted to know anything beyond that, you'd have to learn by doing. Number 15. Mail order brides. Popular representations, cultural myths, and present-day phenomena suggest that mail order brides were a sensation of the American West during the 19th century. Purportedly, lonely pioneers could purchase women through a catalog who would then become their lawfully wedded wives. This image carries with it an air of scandal, and for some, it evokes a sense of repugnance. Is this not objectification of women at its worst? This caricature of mail-order brides, however, does not represent the reality of mail-order brides in American history. Men did not purchase wives. At most, they paid for their betrothed's travel fare, but the two had sought each other out and corresponded before deciding to marry. Although the phrase mail-order brides does not accurately reflect the historical phenomenon, this article will use the term because it has become the common moniker. For these purposes, a mail-order bride was a woman whose introduction to her husband came through the mail, and one who made plans to marry him before meeting in person. Between the 1900s and the 1920s, newspaper reporters used the phrase mail-order brides to describe such women. Interestingly, neither the men nor the women who would come together in a mail-order marriage ever self-identified that way. Instead, they tended to write personal ads that closed with the statement "object matrimony," followed by a mailing address. Prior to the 20th century, newspapers referred to the same phenomenon as correspondence courtship and an epistolary courtship. This article considers any relationship that was facilitated by the mail to be of the mail order variety, regardless of the terminology that the original authors used. Number 14. Anything but private. When the Wild West was still a wild place, it wasn't all about two people camped out in a bedroom and getting naughty between the sheets. In fact, it was the exact opposite. As it was more common for multiple families to share a house or large room, which meant there was a lot of partner sharing or sex without much privacy. Having more space meant having more money, and those in the Wild West often didn't, meaning shared rooms or houses and finding strategic ways to get off. It was common in the Wild West for families to live in small houses, usually made up of one large room. So naturally, when it came down to every member of a family sharing one space, privacy wasn't possible. In which case, it's fair to question how they would get intimate when sleeping in a bed with children or other relatives. Writing on the development of privacy and adult pleasure as a private practice in Europe, author Brian Watson explained that during the Reformation, Figures such as Martin Luther created a sanctity of privacy surrounding intimacy, something previously non-existent. In the United States, this type of privacy was afforded by class. Money meant privacy, and most in the Wild West didn't have any money. Number 13, not much was going on. There is absolutely no doubt that oral sex is awesome, but there wasn't a whole lot of it going on in the Wild West. It's not as if it was something that wasn't around elsewhere in the world, but people in the Wild West actually seemed to think that it was too European for their personal liking, which is why it wasn't going on. In fact, oral sex was so sparse that even prostitutes were against it, shunning other workers who performed it. Number 12, some things were too risque for cowboys. In the book Slumming, Sexual and Racial Encounters in American Nightlife, 1885 to 1940, Chad Heap, Associate Professor of American Studies and undergraduate advisor of the Women's Gender and Sexual Studies program at George Washington University, explained that oral pleasure was considered a little too foreign for Americans during the time period and therefore wasn't readily performed. There's evidence that even sex workers were against it and would shun others who didn't mind engaging in the practice. Number 11, assault was rampant. A very sad, very real fact of the Old West was that women didn't have many options. Women were emphatically considered secondary to men in social standing, which created a culture of endemic sexual assault. There were few, if any, avenues of recourse for survivors. According to author and women's crisis worker Nancy Williams, in the last 150 years, we've gone from the steam engine to the jet engine, from horses to Learjets, and from outhouses to gold-plated indoor plumbing. Yet the progress women have made in defending against sexual assault really hasn't matched the pace of technology. Number 10, brothels. Brothels were a common sight in frontier towns. Prostitution was technically illegal throughout the Old West in the 19th century, but that didn't seem to stop anybody. Lawmen were often few and far between. Laborers, miners, and itinerant workers were rough and tumble men. They sought a good time after a hard day's work, and they were willing to pay for it. These soiled doves and sportin' women who populated the brothels were happy to comply if it meant taking in big bucks. As the West was won, brothels became town centers in much the same way as saloons. Migrant laborers, cowboys, and outlaws alike gravitated to them. For a little hard-earned cash, pleasure was easy to find. The women who ran those establishments did big business. In fact, it was one of the only ways frontier women could make money and assert themselves in an otherwise male-dominated society. By the end of the 19th century, many boomtowns made no show of hiding their red light districts. In one infamous instance, the 1895 Traveler's Guide of Colorado explicitly listed out brothels operating in the state. Traveling men could pick out any establishment from 66 pages of information. It was like Yelp for the old days, with an adult angle. That's not to say the sex industry was healthy, of course. Countless women died from childbirth and venereal disease as a result of their work in brothels. Others were at the mercy of careless, violent, and sadistic men. In the best-case scenarios, some madams became extremely wealthy, but that was rare. More often, women were used for men's pleasure in these not-so-halcyon days on the frontier. Number 9, madams of the West. During the 1800s, it was extremely difficult for women to obtain a job as a result of the lack of jobs. Ohio History Central confirms that women in general were expected to work in the home, performing domestic chores, growing food, and caring for their children. Those who ventured into the working world were often relegated to roles like school teachers, making just over $80 a year, according to QEMA, laundresses, clerks, and factory workers. In the latter field, women were subject to awful pay and working conditions. A job in the prostitution industry, however, gave women independence and a way to make good money. An example is the celebrated courtesan Ah Toy in San Francisco during the 1850s. Writer Myra Rose Holman says that men paid an ounce of gold just to have a look at her. Of all the classes of prostitutes, streetwalkers, crib girls, common prostitutes, and even parlor house girls. Being a madam was the most lucrative. Some, like Salida, Colorado Madam Laura Evans, loved to sing and dance and get drunk and have a good time, according to writer Emma R. Merrick. Alternatively, Denver Madam Maddie Silks explained that being a madam was a way for a woman in those days to make money. And I made it. Author Heather Brandstetter submits that the sex industry was indeed a needed service and even kept sex crimes at a minimum. In general, madams fell into three categories. Some, like Helen Harbin of Carson City, Nevada, served as mere landlords over a brothel property. According to the Las Vegas Sun, Harbin inherited the brothel after her husband died. Although she never worked in the sex industry, she rented out the house to various madams. Likewise, Madam Laura Evans confirmed that when she began her career in Leadville, she rented a bordello from another madam, Lou Bunch. Later, Evans ran her own parlor house, but hired Lillian Powers to run her cribs, small two-room apartments in Salida, after Powers was run out of Cripple Creek by her own landlord, a French woman known as Leo the Lion. Evans, Bunch, and thousands of others often ran their own brothels. These were not common houses of prostitution attached to a saloon. Rather, the best madams operated out of fancy parlor houses where, according to Emma Merrick, the employees were boarders who lived and worked in the same house. The ladies paid about half of their earnings to the madam for room and board and were generally allowed to keep their tips. Prices at a parlor house could be anywhere from $10 per customer in the primitive mining towns to $50 in larger cities like Seattle and San Francisco. Number 8, the worst peril of all, pregnancy. The most horrible thing a young woman can experience is an unintended pregnancy, which puts her out of work and makes it hard for her to run her business. Boston University reported on one archaeological dig of a brothel, which revealed syringes used to ingest mercury, arsenic, and vinegar into the body to induce abortions or treat diseases. The owner of the house, Mrs. Lake, later married a doctor who also prescribed medicines for treating sexually transmitted diseases and inducing abortions. But the women's biggest hurdle was the Comstock Act of 1873, which not only banned birth control items and information, but also terminations. Thus, women had to come up with their own homemade remedies to keep from getting pregnant. The true number of infants produced by working girls in the Old West will never be known. Terminations were never reported because of the Comstock Act. Anne M. Butler wrote that stillborns and fetuses were often quietly disposed of or buried without record. In February of 1877, Mary Keene, along with Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Wicks, was charged in Laramie, Wyoming, for failing to provide a proper burial for a fetus. The child was probably Mary's. Other women, such as Laura Evans of Colorado, were able to raise their children, sometimes out of the prostitution realm. In an interview with her great-grandsons, the men verified Laura's daughter Lucille didn't talk about her mother, but just described her mother as being a landlady. Number 7, marriage, a viable option. The best a working girl could hope for was to marry and leave the profession for good. Emma R. Merrick cites a respectable woman named Mary Matthews of Colorado who observed, sometimes a good citizen, wealthy, and respectable, marries his wife from some of these corrupt houses, and he seldom ever regrets his choice. He builds her up to be respected and respectable. I have heard of several cases. Likewise, according to writers Vardis Fisher and Opal Laurel Holmes, Denver Madam Maddie Silks told others, "My girls made good wives. They understood men and how to treat them, and they were faithful to their husbands. So I knew they made good wives." Author Helen M. Lewis theorized men were willing to marry saloon girls and prostitutes largely due to the shortage of women in the early West. One of her sources cited the ratio of males to females as 10-1, while another guessed there were from 3 to 30 times as many unmarried men as unmarried women in the West. Therefore, any woman described as virgins, including aging spinsters, as well as widows with children, divorcees, and prostitutes, were fair game. Still, some working girls were hesitant or even afraid to marry. In writing his memoirs of the gold rush, Tom Kinnerk recalled sweet-talking one of the dance hall girls, telling her about a nice farm in Indiana, but she said, "No, Tim, you would not want to marry me when you get that farm." Number 6, dance hall and flirtations. Dance halls were not just venues for dancing. They were also places where people could meet and engage in flirtation, sometimes leading to more intimate connections. In the Old West, dance hall girls were hired in saloons as a form of entertainment for the men of that time. Not only was it a profitable way for the owners to sell more drinks, but also a way to help provide an entertaining evening for the lonely men. Although the men loved it, the upstanding women were very much against it and quite suspicious of their presence in the area. They considered the women that were employed by these saloon keepers as provocative women and called them many things such as painted ladies, disgraceful, ladies of the night, and much more. The truth was, though, that most of them would never have even considered prostitution. It was just as degrading to them as it was to the women who were making that assumption about them. In the Old West, dance hall girls were hired in saloons as a form of entertainment for the men of that time. Not only was it a profitable way for the owners to sell more drinks, but also a way to help provide an entertaining evening for the lonely men. Although the men loved it, the upstanding women were very much against it and quite suspicious of their presence in the area. On the contrary, these dance hall girls were making good money without having to stoop to that level. They also got to dress up in bright-colored ruffled skirts and petticoats, all decorated with fringe, sequins, lace, and other embellishments. Many would carry pistols or daggers on them for protection, hiding them either in their bosom or inside their boots. They even wondered why the respectable women would choose the life of being a wife and mother who had to work so hard on the farm along with raising a family. Many of the girls came from farms or mills themselves. A lot of the dance hall girls did eventually become wives later in life, after they had saved their money and had nice little nest eggs. Number 5, the story of Belle Starr. Born to a well-to-do Confederate sympathizing family, Myra Maybelle Shirley Starr, later known as Belle, and eventually the Bandit Queen, was a teenager in Syene, Texas in 1864, when outlaws Jesse James and the Younger brothers used her family's house as a hideout. In the years that follow, Starr married 3 outlaws: Jim Reed in 1866, who ran with the Youngers, James and Starr gangs, and was killed in 1874 by police, Bruce Younger in 1878, and Sam Starr, a Cherokee, in 1880. After Belle and Sam Starr were later charged with horse stealing, a federal offense for which she served time, she was again charged with horse theft in 1886. This time, because of her legal skills, she was acquitted. But in the meantime, her husband and an Indian policeman had shot each other to death. Starr herself was murdered February 3, 1889 at the age of 40, close to her Oklahoma cabin in the Cherokee Nation. Some suspect her son, Ed Reed, whom the Texas State Historical Association asserts she had recently beaten for mistreating her horse. The crime has never been solved. 2 days following her death, the New York Times called her the most desperate woman that ever figured on the borders. But according to Glenn Shirley, author of Belle Starr and Her Times, The Literature, the Facts, and the Legends, the only truth in the report was the fact that she had died. Almost overnight, the name of Belle Starr became a household word throughout the nation, he writes. She had been elevated to a seat of immortal glory as a sex-crazed hellion with the morals of an alley cat, a harborer and consort of horse and cattle thieves, a petty blackmailer who dabbled in every crime from murder to the dark sin of incest, a female Robin Hood who robbed the rich to feed the poor, an exhibitionist and clever she-devil on horseback, and leader of the most bloodthirsty band of cutthroats in the American West. All this despite the lack of a contemporary account or court record to show that she had held up a train, bank, or stagecoach, or killed anybody. Number 4, the lack of women in the West. According to the 1870 census, each of the western states, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Washington, and Wyoming, showed a larger population of men versus women. The difference in numbers could be drastic. In the area of South Park, Colorado, during the late 1800s, the ratio was 10,519 men to just 91 women. per red light women of the Rocky Mountains. According to True West, men going west without their female companions were forced to share not just domestic duties, but also social activities. At dances, men would sometimes tie handkerchiefs on one arm to denote them as the female partner. Author and Old West researcher Deborah Huford submits that same-sex relationships among men in the West were acceptable since there were few women. Men working as farmers, loggers, miners, and ranchers in remote places found themselves with no other choice for romance. Sharing a small cabin with another man often meant sharing a bed, and there apparently was no shame in it, the exception being the rarely publicized sex crime. Dr. Thomas J. Knowles' article in the Social Science Journal tells of an 1885 incident in Denver, wherein an older man promised a young man room and board, only to rape him. Number 3, men made do with bachelor marriages. In the Old West, men who shared an intimate relationship with one another were often referred to as being in a bachelor marriage. Deborah Huford defines the arrangement as one of convenience for two men wishing to live together as a couple. Public discussion of their relationships, however, has been largely avoided. The Journal of American History explains that although same-sex couples have been recognized throughout history, few historians have cared to address their sex lives. By ignoring that aspect, the contemporaries of such couples could avoid facing the uncomfortable fact that sex between them was possible. The Pride also theorizes that some scholars have swept connotations of sex in bachelor marriages under the rug, but they were certainly there. One poem, published in 1915 on the fringe of the frontier West's last days, talked of the love between two men that was more than any woman's kiss could be. What little in-depth research there was in the early 1900s often ignored the idea that men-to-men unions included sex. And it is highly unlikely that gay men talked of what went on behind closed doors. The few exceptions include William Drummond Stewart, whom Extra confirms openly hosted a big gay medieval-themed orgy during a fur trade rendezvous, per William Benneman's biography Men in Eden, William Drummond Stewart, and Same-Sex Desire in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade. Number 2, women's suffrage and lesbianism. As Dorothy A. Mays points out in her book, Women of Early America, it appears that early sodomy laws seem to have applied only to men in the period of early American history. There was, however, an instance in 1642 when a servant named Elizabeth Johnson was punished in Massachusetts for unseemly practices betwixt her and another maid. In the West, however, lesbianism wasn't officially recognized until the late 19th century. Before that, lesbians like Catherine Lee Bates, who wrote America the Beautiful after visiting the top of Pikes Peak in Colorado, went unrecognized. Bates openly engaged in a relationship with Catherine Coleman, says the San Francisco Bay Times. Other gay women of the 1800s, reports Monte Cristo magazine, included poet Emily Dickinson, pictured, who shared kisses, and even her bed with her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert. Then there was Pulitzer Prize winner Willa Cather, whom Autostraddle writes preferred the name William in college and lived with another woman for nearly 40 years. Another surprise? Susan B. Anthony, who championed women's voting rights and, according to them, had at least 2 lady lovers during her lifetime, Anna Dickinson and Emily Gross. After Anthony died in 1906, they report Gross was devastated. And although all of these women have long been recognized for their achievements, scholars have only recently begun to acknowledge that they were gay. Number 1, coming out and sexual freedoms. When we look at the history of lesbianism in the 19th century, it can be quite challenging to find much information about it. This is largely due to lesbian erasure, writes Philadelphia Gay News, which points out how biographies of famous women often leave out their sexual orientations. A few original sources, however, do confirm that women were much more open about their same-sex relationships than men. The article on the front page of the Seattle Star that outed Harry Allen, for instance, was rather unusual, as was Allen's public comment that "I did not like to be a girl, did not feel like a girl, never did look like a girl," via Atlas Obscura. There were more. History Links talks of Hannah Banana, a darling old queen who arrived in Seattle in the late 1890s. A notable drag queen, Hannah was still in Seattle as of the late 1930s. She favored hanging out at the casino, an exclusive gay bar in Pioneer Square, where lesbians were welcome. South of Seattle, in Oregon, Alberta Lucille Hart made history as one of the first transgender men to have a hysterectomy in an early form of gender confirmation surgery. As physician Alan L. Hart, he continued working in medicine and married twice, according to Oregon Encyclopedia. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating insights into history's untold stories. And as always, let us know in the comments what other topics you'd like us to explore. Until next time, stay tuned.